Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and today I wanted to give you an exclusive preview of this new video series I've been working on where I'm going to be reviewing hands from Live at the Bike. Live at the Bike is a internet show where they record hands played at the Bicycle Casino in LA, and today they're going to be playing 510 No Limit. I have some reads on the players who are playing at the table, but as this is just a preview, I'm not going to go too deep into them. But whenever I do the main video, I will get a little bit deeper into the reads that I've developed on these specific players. Alright, so let's check this out. In this hand, this guy Ron folds. On around to this player Darren, who I don't really know much about, but he is fairly deep stacked. He likes to raise with ace-8 of clubs to 35. Then he gets around to Matt Salzberg, who was a World Poker Tour Player of the Year. He re-raises to, I believe the actual number was 95. Okay, so he raises 95, and now it's over here to this player Ebony, who plays a decent amount of tournaments. She's a bit on the tight, aggressive side. I think that in her shoes with ace, she has ace-queen of hearts, by the way. I've already watched this video once. She has ace-queen of hearts, and I think in this scenario, she should probably 4-bet or maybe fold. The problem with this is that she only has 1,500, right? And you usually don't want to be calling off something like a 7th of your chip stack with a hand like ace-queen of hearts, because if your opponent ever goes bet, 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 you can't really continue unless you have 2 pair or better. It's a very crappy spot for you when it comes ace-7-4 and your opponent just wants to put his whole stack in. Which, you know, Matt is somewhat loose aggressive. He's certainly capable. So I'm not really in love with this call. I think the only way you're really winning this hand with a call is whenever you flop an ace or a queen, and then there's a lot of passivity. And I'm not really sure if you can count on that. However, the cold call often does slow down your opponents because they have to assume you have something pretty good. So, she likes to call. This guy folds. And it gets back around to the ace-8 of clubs, and I think this is actually a fairly easy fold for another 60 more. He's out of position versus 2 people, and with ace-8 of clubs, you're just not getting the right price, but it seems like he pretty much snap called, so it seems like a very, very easy fold to me. You're going to find that out of position when you do flop a draw, you don't really want to check raise and get it in a lot of the time because you are putting in a pretty good amount of money. You also don't want to check call out of position, so it's very difficult to play draws out of position, and you have to realize with ace-8 of clubs, you're most likely going to flop some sort of draw or a top pair hand that's often dominated, so just fold this, avoid this crappy spot out of position. If he was somehow in position, maybe he could call, but obviously that's not what we're looking at. So comes Queen Jack Jack, 2 clubs, which is good for Darren. This is the exact spot I was just talking about, where if, say, Darren checks, Matt Salzberg bets, say, 200, Ebony folds. Obviously, Ebony's not going to fold. Darren, I don't think he wants to check raise and get it all in for 2,000 with a draw that's not even to the nuts. So that's not a good option. He doesn't want to check call. That's also not a good option. So, I mean, what is he supposed to do? It's a terrible spot. And he got in the spot by calling pre-flop. So what should Matt do on this flop? Say Darren checks. Darren's going to check a lot at the time. I think Matt should probably check behind. This board is very, very, very coordinated. It's way too easy for either Ebony or Darren to have something that they're never going to fold. So, given that Matt has very little equity, I would probably just be in check fold mode. If they check around to Ebony, I would probably check behind, which may be surprising to some people. But if you get check raised on this board, you're in such a miserable spot, and you definitely want to avoid those miserable spots. So in her shoes, she should check behind and see what develops on the later streets. It's not necessarily checking for pot control or anything like that, but you're checking because you're not really sure where your hand stands. And if a lot of money goes to the pot on the flop, you're thoroughly unhappy. So I guess the only questionable thing is Darren could lead the flop, but if he leads and get raised, he's, again, just in a terrible spot. So maybe he could lead and get it in, bet something like 200 and then shove over a raise. Or bet 200 and then bet the turn and then jam the river as a bluff when he misses. That could be pretty strong. It's a crappy spot for Darren. And, you know, whenever you're going to be in this spot a lot of the time, I'm a big fan of just not getting involved. So, again, in Matt's shoes, seems like a pretty easy spot just to give up. I don't like that he snap checked. That looks extraordinarily weak. And then Ebony does check behind. I like her check behind. I already listened to this with the commentators speaking, and they did not like her check behind, saying, oh, you need to bet for protection or whatever. And I think they're only saying that because it's clear that the opponents actually had some equity. I wonder if they would be saying that if the opponents did not have equity. Someone's hammering over my head right now, so hopefully you guys can't hear that. So yeah, I like to check behind, because if you ever get much action, you're not happy. So turns a 10, and I think at this point Darren does need to bet. He's not really looking to check raise on this turn or check call, and with the various gut shot draws, I think he needs to be betting. And also, if his opponents both have nothing, they're just going to fold. Like, let's say Matt has pocket 8s, Ebony has pocket 6s, they're just going to fold. I do think that Ebony's going to have something I think Ebony's going to have something a pretty good amount of the time, because you have to ask, what are people cold calling 3-bets with? And I think it's mostly big suited connectors and pretty good pairs, and obviously this board is really good for those, but I think he still should probably just bet. I mean, and he's betting because the other options are just so atrociously bad. And if I am going to bet, it's going to be something like 180. I think that's a good amount that's going to give you some folds, while not making the pot gigantic. So he bets 130, which is very small. I don't really like this bet because it induces your opponents to call. And you don't want to induce your opponents to call when you have a marginal draw. And this is a marginal draw. You must be able to look at this and recognize, oh, I have a bad gut shot, bad double gut shot. And the reason it's a bad double gut shot is because the 9 gives him the bad end of the straight, and the king puts up a board that's so incredibly draw heavy that you're not going to get paid off unless your opponent has a really good hand. This is pretty much an ace or better. So in Ebony's shoes, I do think she needs to just call. She could easily be crushed at the moment. So I like a call from her. As you see, it's not like you're trying to build a gigantic pot with the top pair. You're trying more so to not get your stack in, because you could easily be beat. Alright, river's a queen. Terrible river for Darren, and a very good river for Ebony. In Darren's shoes, should he bluff? That's really the question. And I'm actually not a big fan of bluffing in this spot, because you have to ask, what does Ebony have that will fold, right? So if Ebony has a 10, notice that now a 10 is no good for anyone, so a 10 is going to fold every time. So if she has 10-9 or king 10, she's going to fold. With ace 10, she may find a hero call. Say she had maybe king 9, that might find a hero fold, but I'd be kind of surprised. Ace king's probably just going to look you up. So I am not a big fan of betting in this scenario. I'm having a hard time thinking the hands that Ebony would fold that are not already losing to Darren. So maybe Darren thinks he can get her off a chop, but really, what chop can she have? I mean, she has ace 10. That's the only real chop that is reasonable. So if I'm in Darren's shoes, I'm just checking. I'm not necessarily check folding. Me knowing that Ebony's kind of tight-ish on the river, I probably would just check fold to any bet from her. But against some guys, you can conceivably check and then call, because your opponent could easily have a 10, and you have the best hand a lot of the time. So I could go either way. I'm probably just going to check fold 90-ish% of the time on the river. But this is not a very good bluff spot. I think you have to look at this and recognize this is not a good bluff spot. I think what happens to a lot of players is they get in their head, oh, I have missed my draw, therefore I must bluff. But this is a very, very bad river to bluff, because your opponent's never folding a queen or a jack. They're just going to call every time. So if he bets, how much should he bet? I actually don't think he needs to bet too much. Maybe 300, maybe 260. I think that'd be a pretty good amount, because she's either calling with a good hand or she's folding. She either has a queen or jack and's calling every time, or she's probably folding almost everything else. So I think 325 is just a tiny bit too big, but certainly not gigantically big. So on the river, Ebony's certainly going to raise. I want to point out this. Notice that she's doing a lot of chip flipping with her hand. And usually you'll find that chip flipping is a very, very strong thing. Most people aren't doing things that defy gravity in a grand way, unless they have a very good hand. And also, we'll see her sort of like hemming and hawing a little bit too much on the river before raising. I mean, this is obviously her raise on the river screams strength, but also her playing with her chips and sort of notice how big she picks her hands up. She's still flipping the chips around. I mean, this is just clear she has something very good. Unless, of course, she does this every time, but I doubt she does this every single time. So definitely try to pay attention to this sort of thing. She puts in a raise, and I want to discuss her raise sizing. What are her options, right? Notice she only has a 1,300 stack, so she can either min raise to effectively 650, but you're going to find if you put in 650, your opponents will almost always call 700 or 710. You might as well get a few extra dollars. Or she can shove. She could also raise somewhere in the middle to like 900, but I think that looks incredibly strong, because, I mean, who's really putting in almost all their stack, but not all of it, unless they're trying to get value? So I think that's probably one of the worst options. So I think her best options are to either bet something like all in, assuming she thinks this guy's going to call with any jack, or to bet small, something like 710, and just hope to get called by a lot of various jacks. So if you think the opponent's going to fold to a big bet with a jack, then you definitely want to raise small. But if you think the opponent's going to call every time with the jack, you should probably shove. And recognize you're not getting called by anything else. So I think I'd probably go for all in against this Darren player because he seems to be a little bit on the weaker side, just based purely on appearance. Of course, appearances can be very deceiving. So I think I'd probably go for the big bet. But if you think Darren is maybe playing with a short bankroll, or this is his only $1,500 for the day, then I would be a little bit more prone to make it something like 710. And it looked like she put in a pretty big stack. She made it, well, of course she folds every time. She made it 810, and this is sort of that bet in the middle that I don't really like, because, I mean, who's really going to put in 810 and leave themselves 480 behind? That just screams strength so loudly. And the last thing you want to do is scream strength whenever you actually do have a very good hand. So I think Ebony played the hand perfectly up until the river. And on the river, my only concern is perhaps she needed to make slightly smaller sizing. Alright, in this hand we have... Oops, had the volume on. In this hand, we have this player here limping from early position with 10-9 suited. If I was him, I would certainly just raise. He's under the gun. And then Matt Salzberg decides to raise the under the gun limp to 35 with Jack 10, or I think he raises to 30, with Jack 10 offsuit. And I'm not really in love with the raise. I think I'd probably make it a little bit bigger. Let's just get his sizing for sure. Yeah, so he raised to 30. I think that if I was in his shoes, I probably would have made it more like 45, because notice that both Matt with 2,400 and the under the gun guy with 2,200, both of them are fairly deep stacked. So I don't really mind making the pots a little bit bigger in position. That being said, I think Matt could also just fold. I think he could also call. It really depends on what you think about the early position limper, but just going off generic reads, I think I would assume that guy's going to be limping with a bunch of weak hands with the intention of playing them fairly straightforward post-flop, but I would have raised a little bit larger. This guy's thinking about it. He has King 6 suited, and I would probably fold if I was in his shoes. You really don't want to be playing against a limper. Alright, and I remember watching this hand. We see this Eric player call, and it says the stack is only $300, but it's actually more like $600. So it's a little bit unfortunate that their graphics were wrong, because if this player had 600 or 280, I would think shoving would be by far the best play, just going all in. And that's something that a lot of players simply do not do in small stakes cash games. They call, they try to see good flops, and they try to see what develops. But with 600, I think calling is perfectly acceptable. And then, of course, under the gun calls. He's limping because he wants to see a free flop, and Matt did not make it expensive for him. Of course, he's still going to always take a flop with 10-9 of hearts. Alright, so this guy should probably check. There you can see his stack. It's 1, 2, 3, 4... and change left, so maybe he started with 500. This guy checks, and then it's on Matt, and Matt has a few options. He can either check or bet. With middle pair, I lean towards betting in this scenario, because you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do if I'm facing any sort of aggression on various turns, right? So any diamond is bad. You don't want to be bet into on a diamond, because you don't really want to call two streets. You don't want to call on really any blank with the intention of calling again on the river, because your hand looks marginal. If your opponents are betting into your marginal hand, they're either trying to bluff you or they have a better made hand. And it's fairly easy that if two random cards come off on the turn in the river, you're not going to have the best hand with Jack 10, so you're usually best off just betting it, being fine picking it up immediately, and if you do get called, you can assume you're in marginal shape. So if I'm going to bet in his scenario, the pot's 100, I'm probably betting 65 or so. And he bets 55, which is a touch smaller, but whatever. You have to recognize you are betting for protection for the most part, protection slash value. And if you start betting smaller than around 55 or 50 or so, or 40, you're going to start getting called by a lot of random gut shots. Eric calls anyway with the ace-jack, which I don't particularly love out of position. He's going to have a really tough time getting paid off if he hits. And even then, it's not like he's going to win a ton of money off most of Matt's hands, unless Matt has exactly a king and somehow makes two pair or something. And then for this guy with his 10-9 of hearts, I think I would go ahead and peel on the flop. It's 55 to try to win a 210 pot. I don't love calling in this scenario because you have to recognize you're behind a lot of the time, but he has a ton of draws. He has a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. I would call and see what develops. But he probably does recognize that if a 9 comes, he's not thrilled. If a 10 comes, he's not thrilled. So perhaps folding is just the best play. I actually do err on the side of folding in that scenario a lot, but I think with his draws, he just has too many good draws there. If I had 10-9 offsuit, I would definitely just fold. All right, 6 diamonds, that's very bad for Matt. So if I'm him, I'm probably just going to check behind. Not necessarily to give up, but to see what happens on the river. Then this Eric guy just checks again. I mean, notice he's just kind of hanging out in the pot. You usually don't want to be in this scenario because very rarely you're going to win a showdown, and Matt's range to bet the flop, well, looks like he's betting. Matt's range to bet on the flop is often going to be hands with a decent amount of showdown value because he is betting into 2 people. It's not like he's going to be betting pocket 2s there. So I don't really think that this player is going to be able to bluff Matt off of very many hands. And also, he's not going to be able to check call the river. So this is really why you do not want to be playing out of position with a bunch of junky hands like this. He does fire out 200, so he bets almost the size of the pot. And if I'm in Matt's shoes, I'm not loving this, but what you have to ask yourself is, am I good 33% of the time or more? Because he's facing a pot-sized bet, he has to put in 200 to try to win 400, so it means he has to be good about 33% of the time. So will he be? And it's very difficult to say because I don't know this Eric player. Seeing the way he's playing, you know, kind of call-y, passive, I definitely think that Matt should call. Especially early in a session if Matt does not know this player well, there's a lot of value in just figuring out what your opponents are doing. And you may think, oh, I don't want to call 200 off and then lose. That's no good right off the bat. But you have to recognize that if you fold in this scenario, you're getting no information. You cannot move forward and go from there. And I imagine at worst, Matt is good something like 25% of the time, and at best he's good something like 50% of the time. Meaning that if his call is bad, it's probably not that bad, but if his call is good, it's probably really good. And seeing Eric actually has ace-jack offsuit, it's clearly in the really good range. And you only learn that by calling. I mean, if you call this guy 2 or 3 times and he shows you top pair every time or a flush every time, then I think you have a fairly easy fold. But if he starts showing up with stuff like Jack-9 and Queen-Jack and stuff like that, then you should certainly call. Also, something worth mentioning is that you need to figure out how wide your opponent's going to be value betting on the river. If Eric is going to be value betting stuff like King-9, then Matt probably needs to be more prone to fold. But if he's only going to be value betting stuff like King-8 or better, meaning 2 pair or better, or a flush or better even, which some nitty people will do, then I think you have a fairly simple call because his value betting range is just so tiny. And if you know he's capable of bluffing, then he's going to be bluffing way more often than he's going to have a value hand, compared to if he's betting mostly marginal mate hands like King-9 and stuff like that for value. You're going to find that when guys bet pot on the river, it's usually a fairly strong or fairly weak hand, either because they're trying to get you to fold or they're trying to get maximum value. And I actually listened to this earlier, and the commentators said something to the effect of Eric is known to sort of check with his marginal mate hand. So that makes me think that if he's betting, he's very polarized. And just looking at the guy sitting there wearing a sweater and sipping wine, not Matt, the other guy, that's the kind of guy who is probably capable of bluffing you to some extent. So I think Matt has a fairly easy call on the river. A lot of people may look at this and think that, oh, it's a crappy spot. You know, you only have middle pair and you're facing a big bet, at least big compared to the size of the pot. But I think it's a fairly trivial call. As some sort of an etiquette thing here, this guy's trying to talk to Matt in the middle of the hand, or he's yelling right over him. That's usually not a nice thing to do whenever a guy's thinking about a hand. But yeah, so look at this guy, right? Well, he's wearing his mirrored sunglasses, etc. Matt did call. This guy, if you had to pick a guy who's capable of bluffing, this guy's probably capable of bluffing, just looking at him. I mean, so don't be shocked if this guy ends up bluffing you. So Matt did make the call. I think it's a perfectly fine call, very good call. Win or lose, I think it's probably the right play. So, actually, I really like the way Matt played this hand on every street. Besides maybe pre-flop, I may have made it a touch more, and maybe I would have made it a touch more on the flop, but beyond that, I think he played it great. Maybe his small bet on the flop, he made 55 into 100 or something like that. I said I would bet more like 65. Maybe a small bet on the flop induced Eric to call, because maybe he would have folded, maybe he folds to 65 but calls 55. It's obviously very difficult to say, but it's a very interesting spot. I definitely think that Matt played his hand well, though. He recognized he induced a bluff on the river, recognized the opponent was capable of bluffing, so he made a somewhat light but good call. So hopefully you guys liked these two hands. If you have any questions or comments about these, definitely send them in or post them on the Float the Turn forums. Also, check out my new website, jonathanlittlepoker.com, if you have not yet. And I want to thank you very much for watching.